In 1945, when the United States detonated the world's first atomic bomb in the New Mexico desert, the American leadership believed they had secured a permanent seat as the undisputed masters of the globe. They possessed the ultimate weapon, a force so terrifying it could end wars in a heartbeat. But they were wrong. Instead of ending the conflict, that single blast ignited the most dangerous race in human history. Today, the nuclear club is no longer an exclusive, invite-only party. 10 nations now hold the codes to the most destructive technology ever conceived. Some built it through sheer scientific brilliance, others through desperate necessity, and more than a few through high-stakes espionage, betrayal, and shadow deals. From the frozen labs of Siberia to the hidden desert bunkers of Israel, the story of how the world became a nuclear powder keg is a thriller involving spies, honey traps, and the thin line between peace and total annihilation. At the genesis of terror, Nazi Germany and the Manhattan Project. The story doesn't actually begin in America. It begins in a laboratory in Nazi Germany in 1938. Two chemists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, discovered nuclear fission, the process of splitting an atom's nucleus. The scientific community was rocked. They realized that breaking an atom released a massive burst of energy via a chain reaction. By 1939, the legendary Albert Einstein sent a chilling warning to President Franklin D.
Roosevelt.
He explained that the Nazis were already looking into weaponizing this new science. This letter triggered the most expensive and secretive scientific endeavor in history, the Manhattan Project. The US, alongside the UK and Canada, poured nearly 1% of their total GDP into this one goal. They were terrified that Hitler's scientists were ahead of them. Ironically, while the Americans were building entire secret cities like Oak Ridge and Los Alamos, the German program was failing due to bureaucratic infighting and a lack of resources. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, they weren't even close to a bomb. But the world changed forever in July 1945. During the Potsdam Conference, where Truman, Stalin, and Churchill were carving up the post-war world, Truman received a coded message. The Trinity test in New Mexico was a success. The US was now a nuclear power. When Truman coolly informed Joseph Stalin of this new weapon of unusual destructive force, he expected the Soviet dictator to be stunned. Instead, Stalin simply nodded and said he hoped they'd use it well against Japan. Truman was baffled. What he didn't know was that Stalin already knew everything. Soviet spies had successfully infiltrated the Manhattan Project at its highest levels, the Soviet counterstrike and the British betrayal. While Truman celebrated, Stalin was privately seething that the Americans had beaten him to the punch. The Soviet Union had been tracking Western research since 1941. They noticed that American and British physicists had suddenly stopped publishing papers on nuclear physics, a sure sign the work had gone underground. After the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet program went into overdrive. They had stolen massive amounts of data from the Americans, but there was a catch. They didn't trust it. Stalin's secret police chief, Lavrenti Beria, was paranoid that the Americans were feeding them fake data to sabotage their reactors. To verify the stolen blueprints, the Soviets captured German scientists and forced them to double-check every calculation. In 1949, far earlier than Western intelligence predicted, the Soviets detonated their first device, ERDS-1, in Kazakhstan. The American monopoly was dead. The Cold War had officially begun. As you might assume, the third nation to join was the United Kingdom. After all, they were America's closest allies and had contributed heavily to the Manhattan Project under their own program, Tube Alloys. However, in 1946, the US passed the McMahon Act, which effectively cut off all nuclear cooperation with foreign powers, including the British. The UK was humiliated. They realized that to remain a world power, they couldn't rely on Washington. Using their vast uranium supplies from their colonies and their existing knowledge, they launched Operation Hurricane. In 1952, off the coast of Australia, the British detonated their first bomb, securing their place at the table. The super bomb and the French Defiance. By the early 1950s, the stakes shifted from atomic to thermonuclear. Scientists were now working on hydrogen bombs, weapons that fused atoms together rather than splitting them. These were hundreds of times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. Even J. Robert Oppenheimer pleaded with the government to stop, warning it would lead to human extinction. President Truman ignored him. The U.S. tested the first H-bomb in 1952, the Soviets followed in 1955, and the British in 1957. Human destruction potential had just increased by a factor of 1,000. The fourth member of the club was France. Following the Suez Crisis, when the French felt bullied by the superpowers and realized they needed their own force de frappe, striking force, to maintain sovereignty, President Charles de Gaulle was relentless. Despite intense U.S. pressure to stop, France sourced uranium from Madagascar and Gabon. In 1960, in the middle of the Algerian Sahara, they detonated Gerboise Bleu. The message to Washington was clear. France no longer needed a big brother for protection. And the Asian giants, China and the Great Split China, was the fifth to join. Initially, the Soviet Union helped them, viewing China as a fellow communist brother. But the relationship soured when Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev began criticizing Stalin's legacy and seeking peaceful coexistence with the West. Mao Zedong was disgusted, calling the Soviets revisionists. The Soviets pulled their technicians out, leaving China to figure it out alone. Despite being in the middle of the chaotic Cultural Revolution, China diverted every cent into their nuclear program. In 1964, they shocked the world with a successful test at Lop Nur. Even more impressive? Just 2.5 years later, they tested a hydrogen bomb, the fastest transition from fission to fusion of any nation in history. The shadow power, Israel's policy of ambiguity. The sixth nation is the most mysterious, Israel. To this day, only Israel has never officially admitted to having nuclear weapons. In the 1950s, they began building a secret facility in the Negev desert with French assistance. When U.S. spy planes spotted the construction, President Kennedy demanded inspections. The Israelis were masters of deception. They built fake walls and hidden elevators to conceal the bomb-making floors from U.S. inspectors. After Kennedy's assassination, President Lyndon B. Johnson took a more hands-off approach. When the world only got confirmation in 1986, thanks to a whistleblower named Mordecai Vanunu, he smuggled photos out of the facility and gave them to a British newspaper. But before the story broke, the Mossad lured him into a honey trap in London. A female agent posing as an American tourist seduced him into a weekend getaway in Rome. Once there, he was drugged, kidnapped, and shipped back to Israel, where he spent 18 years in prison. South Asia, and the only nation to quit India, followed in 1974. Trapped between a hostile China and a rival Pakistan, India conducted a peaceful nuclear explosion, codenamed Smiling Buddha. While the world responded with sanctions, India eventually formalized its arsenal in the 1990s with a no-first-use policy. The eighth story is perhaps the most unique: South Africa. In the 1970s, the apartheid government was globally isolated and felt threatened by communist neighbors. By the 1980s, they had secretly built 6 functional nuclear bombs, likely with Israeli help. However, as the Soviet Union collapsed and the end of apartheid approached, the government did something unprecedented. Fearing that the incoming Nelson Mandela-led government would inherit the nukes, they voluntarily dismantled their entire arsenal, destroyed the blueprints, and melted down the uranium. South Africa remains the only country to have built nukes and then completely given them up. Pakistan and North Korea. The final members Pakistan's journey began in 1971 after losing a devastating war with India. Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto famously declared that Pakistanis would eat grass if they had to, but they would get the bomb. The hero of their program was Abdul Qadir Khan, a metallurgist who worked in a Dutch uranium enrichment facility. Khan stole top-secret centrifuge blueprints and brought them back to Pakistan. In 1998, just weeks after India conducted new tests, Pakistan responded with 5 of its own. Unlike India, Pakistan maintains a first-use policy, meaning they reserve the right to use nukes if they are losing a conventional war. Finally, there is North Korea. Seeking regime survival, the Kim family used Soviet-era energy help to launch a weapons program in total secrecy. They withdrew from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, and likely using technology purchased from A.Q. Khan's black market network, conducted their first test in 2006. And today they possess ICBMs capable of reaching the United States. The future of the club, beyond these 10, the world is still on edge. US nukes are stationed in countries like Turkey, Italy, and Germany. Nations like Japan are threshold states. They have the tech to build a bomb in months, but choose not to. Meanwhile, the real power lies beneath the waves, where nuclear-armed submarines ensure mutually assured destruction. The science that started in a German lab 80 years ago is now a global reality. The blueprints are out there. The only thing standing between us and the next member of the club isn't the difficulty of the physics, it's the complexity of the politics. Which country do you think will be the 11th member of the nuclear club? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the secrets of global power. Would you like me to do a deep dive into the AQ Khan black market network next?